G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Life of Messiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So thank you all for coming along to this session of the Life of Messiah. Tonight we're looking at the authority of the King. We're in that section. Just a recap on last week. Last week we saw John the Baptist's witness. He points out that his disciples were a bit jealous for John because Jesus' disciples were making more disciples than John. But John points out that he must decrease, Jesus must increase. And he used a Jewish wedding system motif to describe it to his disciples. He says, listen, he says, I'm not the bridegroom, I'm simply a friend of the bridegroom. And as we know, the church is the bride. Jesus heads north up to Galilee because John has now been imprisoned, and the Pharisees start to take notice of Jesus because there's a lot more being baptized by his boys because he's making more disciples than John. And the Holy Spirit also has an encounter for him in Samaria with a Samaritan woman. So he moves up towards there. He's at the Samaritan woman. He's at the well in Samaria. And Samaritan woman is a bit taken aback that Jesus would ask her, a Samaritan, for water. Why, she says, because Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. We looked at that last week, the animosity between these two groups, Samaritans and Jews, more so than Jews and Samaritans. We saw the growth of faith in her during the conversation with Jesus. She addressed him as a Jew first, and then as Sir, then as, are you the prophet? And then, are you the Messiah? And he said, yes, I'm the Messiah. We saw Jesus's method of evangelism. He takes this woman from the physical to the spiritual. He takes her from physical water to spiritual water. He also points out her adulterous, sinful life, proving to her that he knows everything about her, and also, convicting her of her sinful state. And she says to Jesus, only the Messiah will know all things when he comes. And finally, the penny dropped for her when Jesus says, I am the Messiah. Between this woman's testimony and the townsfolk who encounter with Jesus, many of them believed on Jesus as the Messiah. Then we saw his authority to preach. This was Jesus' authority to preach, and his message is twofold. It's salvation-centered. Repent ye and believe in the gospel. Remember, at that time, the gospel was simply that Jesus was the Messiah. He was the Messianic king, and that's what you had to believe. He didn't die at that time, so it wasn't he died, was buried, rose from the dead. His second part of his message was eschatological, which means he was preaching about the kingdom of heaven that was at hand. We saw his authority to heal when he healed a nobleman's son. The nobleman came all the way from Capernaum up to Cana to see Jesus, quite a trip, and he wanted him to come back down to Capernaum and to heal his son, but Jesus says, no, your son's healed, go your way. That's exactly what he believed. The son was healed. Okay, so this week we're into what we're going to see happen now. We're going to see his rejection up there in Nazareth. And this is actually going to be a reflection of what will happen nationally in this paragraph 40 here, which is what we're seeing. We're going to see an initial rejection of him in Nazareth. And then later on in paragraph 71, we're actually going to see the final rejection. So we're going to notice here that what happens locally will happen nationally. This is a section which Luke writes. It's Luke chapter 4, verses 16 to 31. And as was Jesus's custom, he entered into the synagogues on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read. Now, by the first century, synagogues had become a very important facet of Jewish life, especially in regard to prayer life. It was regarded as the most appropriate place to approach God, was a synagogue. It was a structure of the synagogue service that gave rise to the weekly reading of the law, which is the Torah, and the prophets, Nevi'im. And here we see now a contrast made between Jesus standing and sitting. If you ever have the opportunity to attend a synagogue service, you'll see the person reading the scroll always stands, whether he's reading the Torah or the prophets. So the reading of scripture was done in a standing position, which is what Jesus is doing here. But when the rabbis taught, they taught in a sitting position. So we're going to see throughout the Gospels that when Jesus was teaching, he always sat. Here we have Jesus, according to the custom, standing. And this is in Luke chapter 4, verse 16. It says, Jesus stood up to read. At a normal Sabbath service, 7 men were selected to read the Torah portion of the scripture. Torah is the first 5 books of Moses, the law. The 7th reader, he would, call the Maft here, he would read a shorter part of the Torah, but he must read at least 3 verses and then read from the prophets. Now, what we see here is we only have the prophetic part of the reading being mentioned here, and it just happened to be from Isaiah. And the complete prophecy would be from Isaiah 61, 1-3. Now Jesus reads, so he would have been number 7 reader. He would have read the short part of the Torah, and then he'd have to read a minimum of 3 verses from the prophets. And in his reading, he said he reads verse 1 of Isaiah 61, and then a clause of verse 2, and then he stopped. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." He then said to them, he said, "Today this scripture been fulfilled in your ears." And that's Luke 4:21. So that day that in Isaiah 61, 1-2, he says is now fulfilled. The rest of verse 2 and all of verse 3 will actually be fulfilled with the second coming. So the purpose of his first coming was to bring the good news, to proclaim the gospel in all of its various facets. But it is at his second coming that he'll proclaim the day of vengeance of our God. Now, the Mishnah states, the Mishnah is the oral laws, oral traditions that the rabbis made up. It states that he cannot read any less than 3 verses, but Jesus stopped in the middle of this verse 2. He closed the book or closed the scroll and gave it back to the attendant, and then he sat down. Now he's going to expound the text. He's going to teach from the sitting position. Now, this was a clear violation of the rabbinic tradition. He only read half of what he's supposed to read. And then this is one of the reasons we see here that the eyes of all in the synagogue were fastened on him, not in a friendly fashion, because he's broke their rules, and this disregard for their established tradition would have drawn their attention. They're a bit cheesed off. The entire prophecy should have included all 3 verses, but he wouldn't read the entire prophecy because it's not fulfilled in that day. Second reason all their eyes are fixed upon him was because he was getting ready to expound what he had just read. And the rabbis were curious to see what he was going to say. Also, Isaiah 61 was recognized as a Messianic prophecy, even in rabbinic writings. So he's just declared himself to be the Messiah. Well, that's what he just said. This day it's been fulfilled in your ears. Now, when he said it's been fulfilled in your ears, that's exactly, the people understood him to say that he was fulfilling this part of the prophecy. Thereby, he was proclaiming himself to be the Messiah. And then Luke says in 22, it says, "And all bore him witness and wondered at the words of grace which proceeded out of his mouth." So Jesus must have said a bit more than just that, because it intimates here that he did. But Luke only records the main point here. So they were pretty impressed by what he said, but they're also a little bit puzzled. They could not believe that he could speak so well or that he had said these things. And their response, the response was, is not this Joseph's son? Why would they say this? Well, because, they knew him. He grew up in that area. He grew up in that synagogue. We know him. He can't be the Messiah. Now, Jesus responded to this rejection by citing two events with two prophets from the Old Testament. And both of these prophets and the work focused upon the works God had done for Gentiles. And remember, Luke is the one who has a special interest in the Gentiles and in women. So he writes about Gentiles and women in his gospel. The first event happened during the days of Elijah the prophet. At that time, there are a lot of Jewish widows in Israel. However, God sent Elijah to the home of a Gentile widow, a Phoenician woman. And you can see that back in 1 Kings 17. The second event happened during the days of Elisha. Elisha followed Elijah. At that time, there were many lepers in Israel. However, Elisha healed a Syrian leper, an Aramaean leper, and that's 2 Kings 5. What's the point of Jesus' illustration? The point of his illustration is this, that the Jewish people would reject him, which is exactly what they're doing here. They would reject him just as Elijah and Elisha were rejected. And then he says to them, no prophet is acceptable in his own country. That's Luke 4:24. They would not accept him as their Messiah. However, the Gentiles would. That's what he's saying here. He said these things in the synagogue where he was trained and in the town where he grew up, and it produced instantaneous anger in those who heard it. And the town of Nazareth is located in a little valley, and south of the valley we have a cliff that looks down upon the Jezreel Valley. And here they were so angry at what he said, the people now take Jesus onto the brow of the hill that they might throw him down headlong. These guys were enraged. And Luke stated in verse 29 of chapter 4 that he just passed through the midst of them and went his way. Now, the text just tells us that he just walked through them. Perhaps he was using his Messianic power to escape. We don't know. He simply just disappeared, walked through them. But just quickly here, Catholic tradition says that he didn't walk away. He actually leapt from this cliff to Mount Tabor, which is 3 or 4 miles away. And that tradition is actually retained in the Hebrew name for the cliff there is called the Mount of the Leap to this day. Now, Jesus is now going to he's been rejected in Nazareth, and in Matthew 4:13-16, we see here that he's now going to make his headquarters in Capernaum. Where's Capernaum? It's on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee. It's on a busy highway called the Via Maria, major trade route from Egypt going through the land of Israel to Mesopotamia. So this was a very strategic spot because anything that happened up here, it's going to travel either way by people traveling in and out. And up here, this place up in Capernaum, that area, that's where most of his ministry is going to take place. So this road was on the coast of Israel. That's why they call it the Via Maria. It means the way of the sea in Latin. It's a Latin term. Now in 14-16 of Matthew, he quotes from Isaiah 9:1-2. And this passage here predicted that it predicted about this choice location. And in Isaiah 9:1-2, it says, "But there shall be no gloom to her that was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time hath he made it glorious by way of the sea," Via Maria, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. It's the light of Messiah. They that dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined. So the focus here is on the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali. The city of Nazareth is in the tribal territory of Zebulun, which is where Jesus grew up. Capernaum is in Naphtali, which is where his ministry was headquarters. And also in Naphtali's territory were the cities of Chorazin and Bethsaida. And it is in these two cities where, along with Capernaum, Jesus performed the majority of his miracles. So that's why it says the light has shined upon them, the people that walked in darkness. People who walked in darkness were the Gentiles people. So what we're going to see here now is, I gave you a little map there. I don't know if you can see this, but Capernaum is I was going to point to it with my finger, but it's up the top where all the lines meet. That's Capernaum, at the top of the Sea of Galilee. Now, we see Messiah's authority over demons. Remember, we're looking in this section, the authority of the king. We're looking at the authority to preach, the authority to heal, the authority to teach, the authority over demons. So again, we go back to Luke chapter 4, 31 to 37, Mark chapter 1, 21 to 28. Mark said that on the Sabbath day, he entered into the synagogue and taught. So Jesus' reputation has now spread, and it now leads to a debate. And the question is going to be, by what authority was he teaching? And both Mark and Luke say that the people were astonished at his teaching. So the people who heard Jesus were very impressed with the content of his teaching, and they marveled at the authority with which he taught. Now, Luke tells us in Luke 4:32 that his word was with authority, and Mark said that he taught them as having authority and not as the scribes. And what this means is that I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but what this means here is that the rabbis received their authority from whatever seminary, whatever academy they attended. Now, since Jesus never studied in a rabbinic academy, what was the source of his authority? How is he teaching with such authority? They knew that his teaching was something new and that he taught them as one who had authority in himself. He wasn't like the scribes. He didn't need previous rabbinic authority to teach. His teaching and authority came from above. It came from the Father. And remember, we looked at this very early in the piece in Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 to 5. Isaiah 50, 4 to 5. Now, in this instance here, people might be very slow to recognize his authority, but guess what? The demonic world were not, right? Because Luke 4:43 says, and in the synagogue there was a man that had a spirit of an unclean demon. Now, wherever demons confront Jesus, they immediately recognize him and they even cry out, I know you who you are, the Holy One of God. And we see this both in Mark 1:24 and Luke 4:34. Anytime a demon or a group of demons declared who he was, Jesus always silenced them and rebuked them, saying, hold your peace. Jesus accepted no testimony from the demonic world. They're not a good character witness. That's probably the reason. We don't know for sure. Now, here in the synagogue in Capernaum, Jesus ordered the demon to come out of the man and it obeyed him, but it came out with a bit of violence because it obviously didn't want to get out. And Mark described him as coming out with a loud voice. So it causing at least one last spasm of convulsion upon the victim. Now, Luke said that the demon threw him to the ground, but it didn't cause any harm to the person. Dr. Luke, he gives us a bit more details with the medical aspects of Jesus's miracles. So when Jesus cast out this demon by his own authority, by simply commanding it to come out, it created further astonishment. It says, and amazement came upon all of them. They were amazed. And this is followed by the question, what is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. This is in Mark 1:27. So not only does Jesus teach with authority, he also cast out demons with authority. He did it with a simple word and not with any of the formulas used by the exorcists of Judaism, because they have a formula for doing this, but Jesus didn't. He just says, get out. But notice the question raised by those in attendance in the synagogue. By what authority does he cast out demons? And this incident in the synagogue of Capernaum caused the word about Jesus to spread quickly in the immediate area. And the report of him went out straight away everywhere into all the region of Galilee round about. So the news here brings us to the next stage. And this is now we're going to see Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. So he's now going to show his authority over disease. And we see this in Luke 4:38 to 41, and in Matthew 8, verse 14 to 17, and Mark chapter 1, verse 29 to 34. Now, Jesus had just cast out a demon during a Sabbath service at the synagogue in Capernaum. Service is over. It's now time to go and eat the Sabbath meal, and it's customary to go and eat after a special meal after the morning synagogue service. So Jesus now goes to the home of Peter, and that's where he's going to partake of the Sabbath meal. But Peter's mother-in-law was living there, and she was very ill. And both Matthew 8 verse 14 and Mark 1:30 says that she was laid up in bed due to being sick of a fever. But Dr. Luke says she was holding with a great fever. So she was really sick. She had a severe or a high fever. And the way it's written in the Greek tense indicates it was chronic. She had been ill for some time. What's Jesus going to do? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all of them report that Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, but each of them, if you look at each of the Gospels, they stated it a little bit differently. Why? Because it's based upon their particular theme. What's Matthew's theme? Matthew's theme, Jesus is the Messiah, he is the King, right? And so Matthew, the way he writes in Matthew 8, verse 15, it says that Jesus touched her hand. The simple touch of the King was sufficient to heal her. Mark's theme, what's Mark's theme? Well, Jesus is the perfect servant. So he says in chapter 1, verse 31, that Jesus took her by the hand and raised her up. That's the action of a servant. And in Luke's theme was Messiah, the ideal man. And this is in chapter 4, verse 39. And it says that he stood over her and rebuked the fever. Well, that's what a man does. So these three gospel writers reported the healing differently, only including what would emphasize the theme of their gospel. There are no discrepancies between these three accounts. The difference in details are actually complementing each other. All three accounts state that the fever left her. Now, all three also state that she served them. Luke, the doctor, added immediately. Remember, he was the one who said that she had a chronic fever, sick for a long time. But he says she served them immediately. Immediately, boom, back to 100% into it. Now, Mark and Luke says that she served them, the group. But Matthew said she served him, focusing on Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is the King. And so Matthew's theme, Jesus is the king, she's serving him. We're secondary. And now it comes to evening time, sun setting. And this is to emphasize that the Sabbath day was ending and a new day was beginning. Remember, all three gospel accounts here make that point. According to the rabbis, the new day begins at sundown, and once you can see 3 stars in the sky, that's the new day. So as soon as the Sabbath ended, 3 stars in the sky, people started to arrive at Peter's home. They brought unto him all that were sick and them that were possessed with demons. We see that in Mark chapter 1, verse 32. Why? Because of what happened that morning in the synagogue. Everybody comes looking for Jesus to heal their friends, their family, whatever. But they had to wait until evening because rabbinic teaching says you can't heal on the Sabbath. The only time you can heal on the Sabbath is if life could be lost or life was endangered. So those who wanted to be healed had to wait till the sun set before they come. Now, Mark describes them in chapter 1, verse 32. He gives 2 categories of people who were brought to him. They were the sick, and then they were demon possessed. Clear distinction between the two. Physical sickness, demon possession, 2 different things. Common misconception is that, if you're sick, it's because you got a demon. Yeah, nah, it's not so at all. Sickness is not, sickness is not caused by demons. That's a common misconception. Now, it also teaches in some circles that demons specialize in certain illnesses. But Mark clearly distinguishes between the 2 categories, those who are physically ill and those who are demon possessed. Now, in verse 441, he mentioned those who were demonized and set free. Now, as Jesus has done previously, Luke repeated that the demons recognized who Jesus was because they said, "You are the Son of God." But again, Jesus silences them. Matthew added a couple of things the other writers didn't. First, he described the way that Jesus used to cast out demons. He says, with a word, he just spoke, they're out. Simple command was sufficient. He didn't have to do all the rituals the rabbis do. Second, Matthew quoted Isaiah 53, verse 4, saying, himself took our infirmities and bore our diseases. Again, this is another common misconception here, and that is that some teach that physical healing is in the atonement, that Jesus's death on the cross provided physical and spiritual healing, and if a believer has enough faith, they can be physically healed. And what they're saying is that all who are saved can claim healing today. Not so. That's not what he's saying. What Matthew recorded here happened well before Jesus died and well before he made the atonement. This passage cannot mean that all believers will automatically be healed because of the atonement. This quotation, remember, early in the piece we spoke about prophecy, how they vary. This quotation falls into the category of literal prophecy plus an application. All right? Isaiah 53, Isaiah described the fact of spiritual healing from sin through atonement. In other words, he explained what the result of the Messiah's death would be. Isaiah did that. Now, because of one point of similarity, the passage is, Matthew applies the passage to the situation here. He uses the principle of application. Matthew applied what Isaiah said to the physical healing accomplished by Jesus during his public ministry. This doesn't mean that atonement guarantees physical healing in this life. It will only come with the resurrection and the glorified body. No glasses anymore, no poor eyesight, no rotting teeth, nothing like that. Now, here we see Messiah's authority to preach. And now we're going to see this in Matthew 4, 23 to 25, and also Mark 1, 35 to 39, and Luke 4, 42 to 44. In Matthew 4, 23 to 25, Jesus went about in all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of disease and all manner of sickness among the people. Mark and Luke tell us that early in the morning, Jesus went off alone to a desert place to pray. He needed a little bit of peace and quiet, away from the crowds, and a time with the Father to prepare for the next phase of his ministry. So when the apostles find him, he told them that he would not remain in Capernaum, but he's going to go from city to city proclaiming the good news of the kingdom. And we see this in Mark 1:38 and Luke 4:43. This is now the second major preaching tour that he has. The gospel accounts now go on to describe the place and the content and the authentication of his ministry. Where's he preaching? He's preaching and teaching in the synagogues. We see that in verse 23 of Matthew. What's the content of what he's preaching and teaching? He's preaching the gospel of the kingdom. Remember, the gospel he's preaching is not that he died for their sins. He hadn't died yet. He was preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and he was offering himself as the king, Messianic king. What was the authentication of his claims? You know, he's presenting a message. I am the Messianic king. How does he authenticate it? It says he was healing all manner of disease and all manner of sickness among the people. So, and that includes casting out demons. So that was authenticating his message that he was the Messiah. He was the king. Now, we see in Mark chapter 1, 38 to 39, that he goes from town to town, city to city, synagogue to synagogue, proclaiming himself to be that Messianic king. And because of this second preaching tour, reputation is spreading further and further afield. It says in Matthew verse 24, it says that the report of him went forth into all Syria. So he's outside the land now. His reputation's outside the land. Verse 25 says, of Matthew says, and there followed him great multitudes from Galilee and Decapolis and Jerusalem and Judea and from beyond Jordan. So people from all over the place are following him. So his reputation has now gone to both sides of the Jordan. Why? Because Decapolis was those 10 Greek cities on the eastern side, the Greek Gentile city, had a minority Jewish population, and they're all hearing about him. And now we down in the southern and northern parts of Israel, down from Judah up to the top, and Syria, which is now called northern Jordan, what we would now call northern Jordan. And the idea was that he was just a local rabbi with just a small following. Rubbish, because people from everywhere are following him. And now we're going to see his authority over nature. Remember, we're talking about the authority of the king here. We see this in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, also in Matthew 4, 18 to 22, and Mark 16 to 20. Now, in this paragraph, we have the recall of Peter, Andrew, and John. While three, Peter, Andrew, and John, had been named as followers of Jesus, they had not yet been called away from their nets to full-time service to Jesus. This is the point at which we're going to see James numbered among the number of disciples here. Even though they're not mentioned, we also know that Philip and Nathanael are also his disciples by this time. So at this point, we have, there are going to be 6 disciples here. The multitudes, they're all about him. He's standing by the lake of Gennesaret, which is the Sea of Galilee, and he entered into one of the boats. He's on the shoreline, and with him was Peter, and he asked Peter to put the boat out into the water from the shore, just a little short distance, so he could preach to the multitudes. So then while Peter, Andrew, and John were cleaning their nets, Jesus sat down to teach the people. Notice again, he's sitting down to teach. That's a rabbi. A rabbi sits down when he teaches. Now, After teaching the masses, Jesus told his disciples, he says, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a draft. We see this in Luke chapter 5, verse 4. Now, these guys were professional fishermen, and it's daytime. And this was contrary to these professional fishermen. And Peter says, Master, look, we toiled all night and we got nothing. And that's Luke 5, verse 5. Peter is saying, look, hey, we're the professional fishermen and you don't fish during the day. We fished at night. So when you catch fish, we didn't catch any. So we don't go fishing in the day. You're a carpenter, we're a fisherman. Yeah. Peter's experience was, if we put the nets down now, it's no use at all because you don't catch fish in the middle of the day, right? You only catch fish at night. However, after stating his objection, Peter obeyed. In this instance, what we see here is obedience came before experience. He says, but at your word, Jesus, I will let down the nets. We see this in Luke 5, verse 5. Now, contrary to all these fishermen's experience, contrary to Peter's experience and his declaration, they caught a large multitude of fish. And we see that in Luke 5, verse 6. They caught so many fish that the nets began to tear and they had to call for others to help them. And we see this in Luke 5, verse 7. Both boats were so full that they actually began to sink. And when the boats began to sink, in Luke 5, verse 7, Peter recognized the Messiah's authority over nature itself, and his response to that was, depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. Luke 5:8. The others in Luke 5, verses 9 to 10, were equally amazed. They were absolutely stunned at this catch. Although they were experienced fishermen, they had never seen anything like this. And when they realized the uniqueness of the Messianic person, they could then see themselves for what they were, sinners. And if we compare ourselves with others, we might come out pretty well. Compare ourselves with those people in prison or those people who are really bad. We'd come out smelling like roses. There's always someone worse than we are. The proper comparison, however, is what? It's with the one absolute standard, which is the God-man, Jesus Christ. When we compare ourselves with him, our conclusion must be the same as Peter's. We are sinful indeed. Now, Peter has said this. Now, in response to Peter's statement, Jesus did not depart from them, but instead, he called them to leave what they were doing and follow him. Now, what we're going to see here is that this is now a call to full-time discipleship. Jesus says, fear not, from henceforth you shall catch men. In the words of Matthew 4:19 and Mark 1:17, it says, come you after me and I will make you fishers of men. And it says that they left all and followed him. This is Luke 5:11. So the result of this call was that Peter and the others left the fishing business. That was their source of income. That was their livelihood. They left it. Following Jesus meant a total commitment to full-time discipleship. It also meant trusting him to provide for their needs because they had left their main source of income. Now to follow Jesus. Okay. Now, this is a biggie. This is Messiah's authority over defilement, and this has to do with the healing of the Jewish leper. And we find this in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 16, and also Matthew 8:2 to 4, and Mark 1:40 to 45. Now, we're looking at the authority of the king. And here in paragraph 46, we now have Messiah's authority over defilement. And this is the Jewish leper. Now, in the Mosaic law, the issue of leprosy received very special treatment. And the leper in this account has entered into the final stages of the disease. And we know this because Dr. Luke, again, he says something in his gospel. It says that the man was full of leprosy. Now, there are certain key miracles which are recorded in the Gospels which were different from anything else that had ever been performed in the Hebrew Scriptures. And these miracles always caused a unique reaction among the people. The reactions, as well as the fact that these particular signs had never been performed before, constitute two primary criteria for determining that the miracles were Messianic, which means only the Messiah can do them. There's a picture of some, thank you, Getty Images, for a picture there of some lepers. Now, the ability to perform signs and wonders is not unique to Jesus, because during the times of Moses and Elijah and Elisha, God worked miracles through them, right? So to heal someone or raise him from the dead was not unique to Jesus. Elijah and Elisha both did this, and we see that in 1 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 4. However, the divine purpose of the signs and wonders Moses, Elijah, and Elisha did was different. They were to authenticate their prophetic calling. When the prophets performed them, no one ever asked, can this be the Messiah? They never did. And so, when Jesus performed the same miracles, the people glorified God, saying, a great prophet is arisen among us, and God has visited his people. Why? Because previous prophets had already done things like that. They recognized his supernatural character and compared him to John the Baptizer, Elijah, Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets. And later on, we'll see this in Matthew 16, verse 14. However, the scriptures show that he performed some miracles that were uniquely different, and their purpose was to authenticate his messiahship. Now, Jesus later on will say in John 15:24, if I had not done among them the works which none other did, nobody else did them like he did, they had not had sin. But now have they both seen and hated both me and my Father. So he's saying that I'm going to do certain miracles amongst them that nobody has ever done before. First miracle considered to be messianic is the healing of a Jewish leper, which we see here in Matthew 8:2-4, Mark 1:40-45, and Luke 5:12-15. Now in Leviticus, in the Torah, there are 116 verses devoted to the topic, Leviticus 13 and 14. No other disease is treated so extensively by the law. Very specific instructions are given for determining if a person was afflicted with leprosy, and also of how the priest was then to proceed. It's all written out in great detail. Only the priest had the authority to declare someone a leper. And once a priest did that, the lepers would have to immediately tear their garments, and from then on walk around in torn clothing. You see all of this in Leviticus 13 and 14. Had to keep their faces covered from the nose down. They were ostracized from the Jewish community and would need to live in places reserved for lepers only. They were also prohibited from entering the tabernacle or temple compound, and could not receive the spiritual benefits of the tabernacle or temple service. So they were really outcasts. Anyone touching a leper would become ceremonially unclean as well. Therefore, if lepers were traveling on a road from one location to the other, they had to warn others by crying out, unclean, unclean. Now, Moses also provided details of what the priesthood would need to do if a Jew were healed of leprosy. So if someone declared himself a healed leper, a priest would need to meet and inspect him outside the camp. he declared the person healed on that same day, he would need to make an offering of 2 birds. Again, all of this is in Leviticus 13:14. One bird was killed by the shedding of blood, and the other bird was dipped into the blood of the first bird and then set free. For the next 7 days, the priest would need to thoroughly investigate the situation in order to be sure of the healing. As to the question of having been a leper, there would be a record of it, since only a priest had the authority to declare someone a leper. And as to the question of the healing, every part of the body was carefully examined for a total of 7 consecutive days. Every bit of hair was taken off the person's body, and every part of the person's body was inspected. Now, if there were specific circumstances of the healing, that needs to be investigated as well. If everything proved positive after 7 days, the 8th day would be a lengthy day of ritual. On that day, 4 specific things, 4 specific offerings were offered: a sin offering, a trespass offering, a burnt offering, and a meal offering. The blood of the sin offering would be applied to 3 parts of the leper's body: right earlobe, right thumb, right big toe. Leviticus 14 tells us this. Same procedure with the trespass offering, and the ceremony would then end with the anointing, during which oil was poured on the same 3 parts: right earlobe, right thumb, right big toe. Only then would they declare the leper to be free to re-enter Jewish society. And only then would they be able to go back to the tabernacle or the temple. Now, rabbinic writings contain cures for lots of different diseases. Leprosy was not one of them. They had no cure for leprosy, because in the Hebrew Bible, we see that 3 Jews were stricken with leprosy as a divine judgment. Miriam, who was the sister of Moses and Aaron, we see that in Numbers 12. Gehazi, who was a servant of Elisha, in 2 Kings 5. And we see King Uzziah or Azariah, who was king of Judah, 2 Kings 15. So as a result, leprosy was viewed as a divine judgment by God. And the feeling was that there would simply be no possibility of curing a Jewish person of leprosy. Why? Because it was God's divine judgment. So from the time that they completed the Torah, the completing of the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy 31, there is no record in the Hebrew Bible of a Jew ever having been healed of leprosy. In the case of Miriam, that was before the law was given. In the case of Naaman, well, he was a Syrian, he wasn't a Jew. His healing, priests were not interested in his healing, had nothing to perform for him. He was a Syrian. Jesus even stated that there were many Jewish lepers in the days of Elisha, but only Naaman the Syrian was healed of leprosy. And we see that in Luke 4:27. And so the proposition remains: there is no record in the Hebrew scriptures of any Jew ever having been healed of this dreaded disease. Enter Jesus. And in the early days of his public ministry, he healed a Jewish leprosy whose leprosy was fully developed, meaning the disease would soon take over the leper's life. And the fact that this leper was coming to Jesus for healing would also have meant that he already believed in Jesus as the Messiah. And in Mark chapter 1, verse 40, he states his request: "If you will, you can make me clean." He didn't ask, "Can you make me clean?" He says, "If you will, you can do this." He didn't doubt Jesus' abilities. He believed that Jesus could make him clean if Jesus was willing to do it. He also didn't say, "If you will, you can heal me, but you can make me clean." The issue was not healing, but that this was a special disease, unlike any other, that had rendered the man permanently unclean. He just wanted to be clean again. Indeed, it was Jesus' will. Mark revealed Jesus' motivation to heal. It says he was moved with compassion. And we see that in Mark chapter 1, verse 41. And Luke described the method of healing, and Jesus stretched forth his hand and he touched the leper. All 3 gospel writers took note of the fact that Jesus touched the leper. It wasn't necessary for the miracle, because remember, the nobleman's son was, 20 miles away. He just spoke the word. He could have just spoke the word and this guy would have been healed. But no. Why touching him? Why did he touch him? It was a simple act of love. Remember, this was a mark of Jesus' compassion, because this would have been the first time that this man had been touched by human hands since having been declared a leper. He had been rendered untouchable by a priest, and for this leper, it would have been many years of suffering, since at this point, the leprosy had fully developed. Jesus' touch was sufficient to heal, and all three gospel writers state that the healing was instantaneous. Straight away it happened. Jesus healed him by touching him, and then instructed him not to engage in any lengthy conversations, but go directly to the priesthood and begin the process of cleansing as commanded in the Mosaic law. All of the rituals and procedures that we just saw would have to be performed. And then all three gospel accounts, Matthew 8, verse 4, Mark 1:44, and Luke 5:14, tell us something Jesus said that is very significant. When the man presented himself to the priest to perform all of the rituals Moses had commanded, it was to be for a testimony unto them, the priesthood. There was a purpose to this miracle. It wasn't simply an act of compassion toward the man, or more than an evidence of Jesus' ability to perform this great healing. The cleansing of this leper was to testify something to the priests. So Jesus deliberately sent this cleansed leper to the priesthood in order to cause them to start investigating his ministry and the message he was proclaiming. He wanted to force them to make a decision regarding his person and that he was the Messiah, and his message that he was offering to the Jewish nation, the kingdom predicted by the Jewish prophets. They have to come to a decision. So, on the day the man appeared before the leadership and said, I was a leper and have been healed of my disease, they'd have to uproot two birds, and for the next 7 days, they'd investigate the man, finding the answer to these three questions. Had he really been a leper? Was he really healed of this disease? What were the circumstances of the healing? Now, since only a priest could have declared the man a leper, there would have been a record of it in the temple. This would have answered question 1. The 7-day inspection would have proved that he had indeed been a leper and he had been healed of the disease, and answered the question 2. Yes, he was a leper. Yes, he has been healed of the disease. The investigation of the healing would have revealed that a man named Jesus of Nazareth was the one who had healed the leper. And that would have shed light in question 3. In other words, the first recorded healing of a Jewish leper could not be ignored. A unique miracle had indeed occurred. As a result of this, the report of Jesus began to spread abroad even further. And we see this in Luke 5:15. It resulted in the fact that Jesus could no more openly enter into a city. It was like pop star status. Everyone was looking for him. No previous miracle ever caused the stir that this one had. Jesus of Nazareth has done something never seen before, and the Jewish response was unique. We're going to see this in paragraph 47 next week. It was now known something very significant was happening in Israel. And also, at this crucial point of his public ministry, Jesus now withdrew to the desert for a time of prayer. We see this in Luke 5:16. In context, he's now praying about what was about to happen next. And this is where we end today. So we should have walked away from this today having learned something we might not have known before.